Hi, everybody. Welcome. We'll give everybody just a moment to join us. I see our audience numbers climbing and climbing. So we'll get started in just a second. So welcome, everybody. My name is Steve Barnes. I'm a professor in the Department of History here, History and Art History here at George Mason. I'm also the director of our program in Russian and Eurasian Studies. We've been organizing a lot of events over the course of this past semester because we think it's really important that we continue to talk about Russia's criminal war on Ukraine. We think it's just really important that we don't let this topic fall to the back pages of newspapers or slip to the recesses of our mind. And one of the ways that we can do that here at a public research university is to have these kinds of conversations, to invite you in, to let you see how scholars think about this war and think about the issues surrounding it. So I'm really excited today. We are Department of History and Art History here, that I could work with my art history colleagues to organize and bring you this event focused on Ukrainian art. I'm going to introduce my colleague first, and she'll be moderating our session today. Professor Michelle Greet is the professor and director of the program in art history here at George Mason. She predominantly focuses on Latin American art, and she's the author of a couple of different books: Transatlantic Encounters, Latin American Artists in Paris Between the Wars, 1918 to 1939, and Beyond National Identity, Pictorial Indigenism as a Modernist Strategy in Andean Art, 1920 to 1960. So I'm really excited to have Michelle with us, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Steve. And it's just such a pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker, who is Svitlana Shiells. And I'll just give you a little bit of background on Svitlana. Svitlana has been a professor of art history at a number of universities in Ukraine, the United States, and Austria, including at George Mason University, where she has taught numerous times. She completed her studies, including a PhD in art history in Ukraine. She has also worked as a research associate at the Freer and Sackler Galleries in Washington, D.C. For more than 10 years, she was director of the Washington Cultural Fund, also in Washington, D.C. The focus of her research is Eastern and Central European modern art. Dr. Shiells publishes widely and has presented her research at numerous lectures and seminars, for instance, at Harvard University, Tokyo University of the Arts, the College Art Association, the Library of Congress, the Salzburg Seminar, and other art museums, as well as at conferences in London, Tokyo, Paris, Barcelona, Chicago, Montreal, Baltimore, Salzburg, Washington, D.C., Kharkiv, Budapest, and many others. Recently, she has given a number of lectures on Ukrainian art at the Albertina Museum and the Leopold Museum in Vienna, and Columbia University as well. Dr. Shiells is a recent a recipient of fellowships in the field of art in the United States, Ukraine, and Japan. Currently, she is an independent scholar living in Vienna, where she is presenting to us today and working on a monograph. So it is my pleasure to introduce Svitlana Shiells, and she's talking to us today about the question, can Ukrainian art explain why Russia launched the war against Ukraine? So I'll turn it over to Svitlana. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle, for your kind introduction. And also, I'd like to use this opportunity to thank Steve for first of all, for this platform and for his support of Ukraine. Also, thank you all for your interest and your time. And now I will start sharing my slides, and hopefully we wouldn't have any issues that. Do you see my slides?
Yes, I think, yeah, if you just hit play to get things started, perfect. Okay. We see it absolutely perfectly. Thanks.
Super. Let me arrange things here. Okay. This day shocked the entire world. On February 21st, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine and started the barbaric war. Before the war, and even now, some have actively promoted an idea concerning the NATO expansion during the 1990s, suggesting that Russia started this war exclusively because of Ukraine's inclination to NATO and the EU. Such an approach provides a misleading answer. The Kremlin has always known that neither NATO nor the EU will ever attack Russia. Furthermore, Russia has successfully cooperated with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who joined NATO and the EU. Those who advocate such explanation of the Russian war against Ukraine even now are either naive and lacking a clear understanding of the situation, or simply deliberately promote Russian propaganda. How then we can explain the Russian war against Ukraine, which started in 2014 and took a dramatically different turn this year? Searching for possible answer, we have to point out that first, undeniably political reason plays a significant role because Putin has viewed democratic Ukraine as a major threat to his regime. For those who followed Ukrainian politics during the last decade, it is obvious that Ukrainian society is democratically oriented due to its freedom-loving nature. When Ukrainians do not agree with their government, they come out to the streets and peacefully demonstrate, making one revolution after another. Economic reasons, fertile land, diverse minerals, etc., is another motive for Russian aggression. Additional human resources, since Ukrainians are very hardworking and talented people, you can see for yourself how creatively the Ukrainian army approaches military decision and actions. In addition, as the whole world has also realized, and Russians have always known, Ukrainians are great and brave warriors. And last but not least, the millennia-old Ukrainian culture, which unfortunately mainly remains a terra incognita for the West and is the focus of our talk. Creating the myth of Russian superiority based on military might and the glory of Russian culture, Kremlin's propaganda machine always insisted that Russia has millennia-old rich ancient art. In reality, it was ancient Ukrainian culture that Russia always presented as its own. Let's decode at least partially this widespread and unfortunately influential myth. Here are the main periods of the evolution of Ukrainian art, which I normally cover in teaching courses on Ukrainian art. Of course, we do not have the luxury to explore it in chronologically and in depth in one talk, but I will try to do my best to provide a convincing context and some example in support of my main argument that the Ukrainian history of art illuminates one of the main reasons underlying Russia's continuation of aggression towards Ukraine. This map, I love maps, shows well that while the territory of Russia is huge, it is mainly situated around the Arctic Circle. If you follow the second latitude, you can see that Moscow and Stockholm are roughly the same distance from the North Pole. Indeed, the Russian climate is severe and very cold. Ukraine is situated to the south of Russia, and therefore in history book, Ukraine is often referred to as Southern Russia, also Little Russia, or Malorossia. As you well know, all ancient civilizations developed in warmer climates. Ukraine was one of those civilizations, and therefore Ukraine developed its ancient culture much earlier than Russia. Think about an analogy, for instance, with ancient Greek or Rome and the Germanic lands. For the last 2 centuries, Russia intensely belittled and dismissed Ukraine as a country, as a nation, as a culture, and pursued aggressive Russification policies on Ukrainian territory. To support its image as a superpower, Russia has insistently presented itself as a country with deep historic and cultural roots. And since all those roots belong to Ukraine, it's central for Russia to have Ukraine under its control. And this is one of the main reasons for the Russian war. Also, I have to recognize it may be difficult for some Americans to understand this, given that the US is a superpower with no such historical or cultural pretense. Before the war, as you remember, Putin offered to the whole world his history lessons, where he declares that Ukraine as a country never existed, that Ukrainian culture is a myth because it's all Russian, according to him. So let's examine some aspect of Ukrainian artistic heritage and how it might attract the Russian propaganda machine. To begin our discussion of cultural roots, we have to briefly turn to the prehistoric times. In 1965, in Malevich near Kiev, a Ukrainian peasant accidentally dug up a mammoth's bone, which was in the area that had several prehistoric dwellings, including the earliest prehistoric house in the world dating back to 18,000 years. The reconstruction of that house is on the right of your screen. Later, prehistoric Trippian culture developed on the territory of present-day Ukraine. Trippian society was matriarchal, and as many other prehistoric societies, they venerated the mother goddess. In fact, the cult of mother goddess was central. Here are some slender Trippian figurines, which honestly could be easily mistaken for modern sculpture, if not for their size. They're very small. The Trippians developed rich artistic tradition, lavishly decorating their figurines and ceramics with earthy colors and coding their beliefs into various symbols. An archaeologist from the Ukrainian National History Museum in Kiev told me one story. Once in the 1970s, she was working with a group of archaeologists on an ancient site in Ukraine. After a long and hard search, they finally made an amazing discovery. They found a big prehistoric settlement with well-preserved and numerous artifacts, human remains, etc. You can imagine their happiness was enormous, and they wanted to publish the materials and their descriptions. However, before they could do that, they had to send a report and receive an approval. The Soviet system was very hierarchical, and the team accordingly had to report everything to the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine. In turn, the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine had to report to the Ministry of Culture in Moscow. Shortly after sending their report, the group received a message which strongly prohibited them to publish any information about this discovery. A team of specialists from Moscow quickly arrived to the site and, citing an urgent need of further and, importantly, more professional investigation, took, or rather confiscated, everything that Ukrainian archaeologists discovered. Time passed, but the group never received a word about their artifact. However, in a few years, one of the leading Soviet newspapers published an announcement that somewhere in Siberia, in Russia, archaeologists discovered a prehistoric site. On the photos attached, my friend and her colleagues saw the artifacts that they had found in Ukraine. Similar instances were numerous and widespread. Before we discuss Scythian art, I would like to introduce you to a key phenomenon. On this map, you can see stretching from Manchuria to Austria, the vast Eurasian steppe, which is the largest 6,000-kilometer expanse of flat land on the Earth. It allows for relatively easy access from one end of this expanse to the other. On the western edge of this plain is one of the most temperate and fertile regions, lies Ukraine. This geographic fact has been of huge importance for the history of Ukraine, because it has meant that Ukraine would become not just a part of, but a center or a final destination of Eurasian nomadic life. Here, I just want to show you photos of Manchurian steppe, Siberian, and finally Ukrainian steppes. The difference is obvious. And here, this is information I copied from Google before the Russian aggression in 2014, when Ukraine was undivided. It indicates that Ukrainian soil called Chernozem, or black soil, is highly fertile as well as deep, reaching sometimes 6 meters. This war photo also shows how deep it is. Think about this fact. 1/4 of the world's best soil is possessed by one country. No wonder each Ukrainian neighbor wanted a piece of that soil. As a Yale University professor Timothy Snyder points out in his book Bloodlands, before Hitler started any military actions against the USSR, Germany conducted careful research. The conclusion of that research was the following. It's on your screen. Ukraine was agriculturally and industrially the most valuable part of the Soviet Union. Herbert Beck, the responsible civilian planner, told Hitler in January 1941 that occupation of Ukraine would liberate us from every economical war. Hitler wanted Ukraine so that no one is able to starve us again, like in the last war. The conquest of Ukraine would first insulate Germany from the British blockade, and then the colonization of Ukraine would allow Germany to become a global power on the model of the United States. By the way, during the World War II, Hitler also ordered that the Ukrainian black gold, black soil, be excavated and sent to Germany by train. The vast Eurasian steppe, that long corridor, brought many different nomads to Ukrainian land, who in the end always settled there. The Scythian were the most fascinating of the great warrior cultures that dominated the Ukrainian steppes for almost 5 centuries. Scythian were Indo-European Iranian-speaking nomads. They appear in the Ukrainian steppe in the early 7th century BCE. Scythian were ferocious warrior. According to Herodotus, the Greek father of history, who visited Scythia in 5th century BCE, a young Scythian had to drink the blood of his first victim. Moreover, Scythians beheaded dead enemies and made cups out of their skulls. Sometimes a Scythian would ride his horse carrying a long tail made of such cups attached to his horse. Herodotus describes the devastation following the Scythians. These horsemen saved the lives of others only to take them as slaves, but even these slaves were typically blinded. Invincible for nearly 4 centuries, the Scythians were not only a people of great military skills and ferocity, but also extremely influential patrons of the arts. Scythian art is characterized by animal motifs, as you see. They masterfully rendered dynamic, flowing images of deer, lions, and horses. These couple images possess striking grace and beauty. Scythians buried their leaders in kurhane, and in the 18th century, Russian emperors discovered and started to intensely excavate Ukrainian kurhane. For that reason, most of the Scythian gold is not in Ukraine, but rather in the Hermitage Museum. However, one of the most beautiful examples of Scythian gold is in Ukraine. It's a pectoral, which weighed about 1 kilo, 145 grams, and is composed of more than 160 parts attached without any pins or wire. The sense of reality and vitality of the elements is extraordinary. Domestic scenes dominate the first frieze, landscape the second. The element predations that occupies the lower frieze is obviously influenced by Greek mythology. a little bit more detailed pictures. In the first photo, we see two Scythians at work. The one on the right is giving some direct instruction to the other. In the second, the young man carefully and with utmost concentration is milking the sheep. Look at the facial expression of another fellow up on the right, or the vivid images of the offspring. The little birds and even grasshoppers in the middle are modeled precisely and accurately. The Scythians use color enamel to decorate flowers, as we can trace some colors. It seems that this pictorial was dedicated to spring. Spring was the new year, the new beginning. Look at this masterpiece once again. The Scythians closely cooperated with the Greeks, who had already settled on the territory of ancient Ukraine, almost at the same time as the Scythians. Please look again at this map. The triangles mark the Greek cities, while the square accordingly shows the Scythian settlement. For instance, on the territory of today's Odessa, the Greeks also established a settlement during these ancient times. The leading role in the excavation of the Scythian gold played Catherine the Great. While, as we just mentioned, a Greek settlement existed at Odessa's location, and the first chronicles also mentions a Slavic settlement port there, Russian propaganda claims that in 1794, the modern city of Odessa was founded by Catherine the Great. As you see, in the center of Odessa still stands her statue. This is a vivid example of the Russian propaganda machine. Regretfully, there was a long and painful process involving the fate of this statue. It took the city council of Odessa several months until they finally recently decided to remove this monument from the downtown of Odessa and place it in the garden of one of the city's museums. Many in the council and some citizens were against removing the statue to Catherine the Great, which indicates the power of the Russian propaganda machine, even among Ukrainians. On the left, you can see how the monument looks now. Before we leave southern Ukraine, I would like to bring to your attention another fact. Apparently, Putin forces have looted nearly 40 museums in Ukraine, plundering thousands of priceless treasure, including this 1500-year-old golden tiara. In the besieged city of Mariupol, the city council has described how the occupiers have liberated Mariupol from its historical and cultural heritage. The staff of the museum in Mariupol had attempted to conceal much of the collection in a cellar, but the hiding place was discovered. And the curator, who reportedly refused to discover the location of some items, Helena Kucher, was kidnapped at night on April 30th. You see how Russian soldiers are looting the museum in Mariupol on the other photo. The Greeks, Scythian, and other nomads settled in the south of Ukraine in steppes area. The northern wooden part of Ukraine was occupied by the Slavs. As you see on the left, the red indicates the core Slavic area from which the Slavs spread to the northwest and southwest. It is impossible to understand Ukrainian art without taking into account a strong presence of Slavic culture in it. Pagan Slavic religion was not a unified system of dogmas, but rather a complex body of heterogeneous, diverse in character and content religious belief. It was based on the deification of the forces of nature: the sun, earth, wind, rain, trees, etc. Importantly, while Slavs venerated many gods, they never had a god of war. It's a very unique characteristic in the history of Western civilization. Therefore, the spread of Slavs was largely peaceful. Let's first, for a sec, imagine the life of an ancient man. It was hard life. Each winter, a vulnerable man had to accomplish his main goal, to survive, like many Ukrainians right now. We stand in hunger and severe cold. Spring always was an indication of his survival. That's why all ancient civilizations celebrate the new year in spring. So how to celebrate such a realization and express gratitude? Searching for food, ancient people found birds' eggs. An egg itself was not only a source of food, but also of a new bird's life. The yolk was associated with the sun. Thus, eggs were not only a celebration of spring, but also the ultimate symbol of life, of survival, and hope. As you see, the nature itself successfully decorated birds' eggs. Thus, to celebrate life, ancient Ukrainians, starting with the Tripilians and especially Slavs, decorated eggs, which they called pisanka, from the word pisati, to write. Each such egg had its own symbolic design and colors. Making a design on an egg involving dyeing it in certain colors, each design requires a different color base. Such decoration is a time-consuming and very demanding job. Therefore, I want to draw your attention to the high level of aesthetic need of Ukrainians. Of course, each ancient culture decorated ceramics or wooden artifacts. However, such objects usually serve for relatively long time. What we see here is unique. Ancient Ukrainians devoted a lot of time to the creation of this elaborate but highly fragile beauty. The lifespan of such eggs was a few weeks or months. Nevertheless, each year they created hundreds of them again and again. You see here an example of ancient and contemporary design. From ancient times, Ukrainian Slav, following their pagan beliefs, were extremely close to nature and celebrated it year-round on numerous occasions and holidays. Green Sunday, Zelena Nedelya, which was wisely incorporated into the Christian calendar as the Trinity, is one such holiday. Ukrainians adorned their houses with fresh flowers, grasses, and herbs. My grandmother's house was like one on the right during the Great Sunday. The smell, the beauty was indescribable. The house was like a nest, warm, loving, and welcoming. The celebration of the summer solstice, or Ivana Kupala, is a celebration of nature's mightiness, of the unknown, of longing for happiness. Bears jumping over a fire as a symbol of readiness to face life's challenges. In the morning, unmarried girls place their wreaths in the river and carefully observe them. If a wreath sinks, it's a bad sign. If the wreath comes to the bank, that girl will marry locally. If the river takes the wreath far away, that girl will marry and live far away from home. The wreath is indeed a Ukrainian crown, a celebration of nature, or rather the beauty and unity of a man and nature. The wedding wreath in the lower right is different. Instead of flowers, it embellished with the leaves and berries of Ukrainian bush kalina. I would like to show you kalina since the whole world knows that word from a popular song, Ой, Лузі червона калина. Kalina is beautiful in all seasons, as you see, and therefore became a symbol of female beauty. Kalina is also a symbol of Ukraine. Here is how Ukrainian folk artists utilize kalina as a motif. Slavic whitewash houses look fresh and elegant and often have a kalina bush nearby. The interior of Ukrainian houses has always been a special focus of decoration. Ukrainians also decorated their utensils as well as embroidered their clothes, towels, tablecloths, etc. Please remember this characteristic because we will later discuss its influence on modernese. Here's some example of the astonishing and dazzling decoration in Ukraine. Ukrainian decorative art is one of the richest in the world. Look at the elegance of the lines, diversity and vibrance of the colors, harmony and melodic crisp within each unassuming composition. A cuckoo bird, kalina, and rooster are among the most popular motifs. During the summer, Ukrainians took care of their land. During the long winters, they embroidered their attire, partied, played different musical instruments, sang and danced. Traditional Ukrainians love to sing, play musical instruments, and dance. Here on the left is bandura, the Ukrainian national instrument with more than 60 strings. While on the right, the balalaika, the Russian national instrument with only 3 strings. Ukrainian dancing is overwhelmingly dynamic and choreographically rich. Ilya Repin was a devoted admirer of Ukrainian folk art. His very last painting is entitled Hopak. Another traveler, Edward Degas, who also was inspired by Ukrainian dances. Note, according to the publication in Guardian, the National Gallery of Art in London very recently has renamed the title of Degas' work Russian Dancer to Ukrainian Dancer, prompting call for other cultural institutions to rethink lazy interpretation or mislabeling of Ukrainian art and heritage. As a scholar and a former professor, and having taught courses in Ukrainian and Russian art in America, and as you have heard in Austria also, I can attest that the colonization of Ukrainian art and art history is a painful, complicated, and well overdue process. And despite all obstacles, I encourage my colleagues all over the world to support it. Slavic culture never vanished in Ukraine. On the contrary, it shaped and defined each Ukrainian. I'm extremely proud that I grew up in the Ukrainian countryside near Kiev. I was lucky to be raised by my talented Slavic grandmother, while my parents were working hard. My grandma could do everything, taking care of the grandkids, garden, animals, cooking, embroidering, singing, and joking. Her language was so rich, it was like poetry. She taught me, you should walk like a bee, your house should be like a flower, and you should wake up early. Among the many Ukrainian artists deeply influenced by Ukrainian folk art was one who grew up among Ukrainian peasants. It was Kazimir Malevich. Malevich, one of the most significant and influential innovators of the 20th century, was born in Kiev. Unfortunately, in numerous Western scholarly publications, this is the only occasion when Ukraine, or in this case, Kiev, is mentioned. Western and Russian scholarship, with just a few exceptions, traditionally represents Malevich as a Russian avant-gardist and totally ignore any Ukrainian influences. Understandably, Russian art historians did it for ideological reason in order to cross out the Ukrainian heritage from Malevich art, and Western scholars often have naively trusted and followed. Malevich came from a humble family. They live in the countryside around Kievan, as well as other parts of Ukraine. He knew and was deeply fascinated by Ukrainian folk culture. He spoke and wrote in Ukrainian and loved to sing Ukrainian songs. He wrote, "The circumstances in which my childhood was spent were the following. My father worked at sugar beet factories far from any city. The sugar beet factories were large. Peasants, young and old, work on this plantation almost all summer and fall. As a future artist, I feast my eyes upon the field and the colored workers who weeded or dug up the beetroots." Malevich identified himself as a Ukrainian. His father was of Polish descent, but his mother was Ukrainian, according to Ukrainian art historian Dmitro Gorbachev. In his second autobiography, which Malevich wrote just 2 years before his death, clearly understanding the brutality of the Soviet regime and the constant attempts to change fact and sources, Malevich declares that he was Ukrainian, not Russian. He wrote, "Leo Kwachevsky was my very closest friend. We couldn't live without each other. We discussed other matters when we ate or reminisce about the Ukraine. He and I both were Ukrainians." Malevich art served as indicative proof of his uninterrupted interest in the life of Ukrainian peasants, who were his favorite subjects, as you see. Concerning Ukrainian artistic skills, Malevich underscored the village, as I said earlier, engaged in art. This peasant scene contains the whole mystery of my sympathies with peasants. I watched with great excitement how the peasant made wall paintings and would help them smear the floor of their huts with clay and make design on the stove. The peasant women were excellent at drawing roosters, horses, and flowers. Thus, Ukrainian peasant, the carrier of a deep inner aesthetic desire or subconscious need, had highly refined taste and were Malevich's first and the most influential art teacher. It is important to understand more generally the role of peasant in Ukrainian history and culture. The intense Russification of Ukraine that started in the 19th century targeted first of all Ukrainian urban centers. Smaller towns and villages were less affected. Due to this, Ukrainian peasants becomes a true carrier of Ukrainian culture in all its diversity and depths. Growing up among Ukrainian peasants, Malevich knew their culture, their tradition, folklore, etc., because he was one of them. Therefore, his deep fascination with Ukrainian peasants, which are the most popular heroes of his canvases, as we already noticed, was sincere and continuous. Ukrainian peasants and their culture, Malevich's main source of inspiration. I recall that after 1918, Malevich practically stopped painting and dedicated his career to teaching and writing. In 1927, he returned to Kiev and also returned to painting. However, due to the increasing pressure of the Soviet government, he abandoned suprematism and came back to figuration. As this painting attests, Malevich was happy to be back in Ukraine, having an opportunity to reconnect with his colleagues, his root and childhood memories. Here is another passage from his autobiography. The peasant's entire way of life attracted me strongly. I thought that the peasant's life is wonderful, that they had everything they need. They made everything for themselves, even paint. Everyone had a garden and pears and apple and plums and cherries. I imitated the peasant's entire way of life. It was against this background that my feeling for art developed. In 1928-29 paintings, Harvest, Malevich again returned to the depiction of harvesting scene. And here I would like to bring to your attention one small detail. A girl depicted from the back alongside a small child is carrying lunch for her family, harvesting the crops. In her left hand, she keeps a bundle with bread, and in her right hand, she has a traditional Ukrainian double pot, which peasants, usually children, used to carry food for their family members working in the field. In one pot, traditionally was borscht, Ukrainian red beet soup, or other kind of soups, and in the second pot were some cooked grains, kasha with meat or some vegetables or dumplings, pierogi, etc. Normally they were covered by a wooden lid, as we see in the left-hand photo, or by a baked dough. Ukrainians like to eat. Here a small passage from Malevich autobiography. I like the peasants' food and often ate at their houses. Even so, we had the same things at home. Theirs tasted better. One scholar mistakenly described this pot as buckets, vidra. This fact again illustrates, first, the presence of the powerful and ever-present Ukrainian factor in Malevich art. Second, that Malevich was well-versed in the life of Ukrainian peasant. And third, without taking into account the role of Ukrainian culture in Malevich oeuvre, it is impossible to understand his art. I have so much materials, I have to hurry. In 1815, the large futurist exhibition of paintings, 010, featured numerous icons of Malevich suprematist art. At this exhibition, Malevich also introduced his watershed painting, The Black Square. The way he presented it in the corner immediately recalls traditional Ukrainian houses in which the main icons was placed up in the corner. Apparently, Malevich first painted the Black Square, and only then, as he admitted, lost sleep trying to explain it in accordance with his new revolutionary theory. Here are just a few attempts. The artist can be a creator only when the forms in his paintings have nothing in common with nature. Or it is from zero, in zero that the true movement of being begins. Knowing this fact, we might ask, what was the first stimulus that inspired him to create this masterpiece? Each of us may have our own reading of this work. I will share my own interpretation of this masterpiece based on my Ukrainian background. Like Malevich, as I said, I grew up in the countryside near Kiev. I clearly remember the awe and sense of profound mystery which I experience every spring, looking at the freshly plowed, beautiful square of my grandmother's piece of black land. As Malevich's lower painting and drawing indicates, he himself was preoccupied with the simplicity and profound mystery of dark plowed Ukrainian black soil fields, as they feature often in his works. For me, the black square is first and foremost the freshly plowed black soil of Ukraine, and among other things. Malevich wrote, I transform myself in the zero form and emerge from nothing to creation, that is, to suprematism, to the new realism in painting, to non-objective creation. Let me repeat, emerge from nothing to creation. Whatever one puts into that overwhelming darkness of plowed soil in spring will grow into creation of fields of wheat, rye, or other crops that creates or sustain life. Chernozem, black soil, the earth, is the greatest creator. Here I would like to discuss the influence of Ukrainian folk art, in particular embroidery. It is especially evident in this 1918 composition called White on White, because in Ukraine we have technique, embroidery technique, which was also called white on white. And this particular painting, I will talk a little bit more because scholars have never placed Malevich painting, this particular painting, in the Ukrainian context and have thus misread it. In 1932-33, Stalin created an artificial famine in Ukraine known as the Holodomor. And you probably have heard a lot about this. You can see on one photo, shows hungry Ukrainian peasants in search of food during the Holodomor living in their houses. And the current situation in Ukraine comes to mind immediately. In 1932, Ukrainian borders were sealed and armed forces visited every peasant's house to take everything that they could eat. Several million Ukrainians died during that period. Estimates range from 4 to 10 millions. Many have considered the Holodomor to have been genocide. After the dead body of Ukrainian peasants were hidden, Stalin sent in Russians to occupy the empty Ukrainian houses. Thus, Malevich painting peasant between a cross and a sword or running man represent his comment on the dire situation in Ukraine. A man with black face, hands and feet is running away from the inevitable death sentence, hunger. One also cannot, we will move further, understand Ukrainian art as well as this war without understanding the importance of the art of Kievan Rus. Situated on the hilly right bank of the Dnipro River, he was at the center of trade routes between the Greeks or the Byzantines and the Vikings. It was a rich and well-developed city. According to Kievan Rus was not only a prosperous but culturally highly advanced medieval culture. As Bessie pointed out, Great Kiev, the radiant and many-colored, stood high on the bank of the river Dnipro. The city in the 10th and 11th century was one of the wealthiest and most animated cities of Europe, larger than Paris, which at the time had 8,000 inhabitants, and twice as large as the small city of London. Excuse me. At the end of the 10th century, Kiev adopted Christianity from Constantinople. It is crucial to note that Kievan princes were extremely open-minded and democratic, a characteristic which was never within the fabric of Russian political elites. Because, and here I have to warn you that this might seem radical for some of you, Russian politics, as well as its military and administrative systems, were shaped not by Kievan Rus, but by the Mongols, who, as you recall, controlled Russia for 3 centuries. If you are my students, I would provide you with a list of literature supporting my views. In contrast, Ukrainian was not under the Mongols, even so they destroyed Kiev in the 13th century. Thus, Kievan princes considered all known religions at the time, including Judaism and Islam, before decided to adopt Christianity. The beauty of Hagia Sophia and Constantinople reportedly played a decisive role. Here is a monument of Prince Vladimir in Russian, who baptized Kievans. Recall during the opening of the Winter Olympic Games in 2014 in Sochi, before Putin started the war in Ukraine, the Russians consistently alluded to the heritage of Kiev as their own. Putin personally, and on numerous occasions, mentioned Prince Volodymyr, for instance, after the annexation of Crimea, and presented him as the founder of Russia, which is incorrect to say the least. Significantly, Putin sees himself as important to the history of Russia and the region as Prince Volodymyr was. During the reign of Yaroslav the Wise, Kiev became even bigger. Yaroslav, by the way, was fluent in 5 languages, and according to the chronicle, read constantly day and night. He also built the Golden Gates and Annunciation Church. Here is a quote that Kievan princesses and princes married numerous ruling houses of England, Germany, France, Sweden, Hungary, Byzantium, etc., including Anna Yaroslavna, who married Henry I. Yaroslav the Wise also built St. Sophia. The structure, you can see, has 5 naves, and quite surprisingly for Byzantine architecture, 13 cupolas symbolizing 12 apostles and Christ. I just quickly want to show you the beauty of St. Sophia. It has 2,060 square meters of mosaics and 3,000 square meters of frescoes. We witness a strict system of harmonious unity of composition and technique. And here I would like to bring your attention to this quote. The medieval writer Leon called St. Sophia Cathedral a church of wonder and glory, the envy of all the countries far and wide. The medieval writer was right in all respects, including envy. This envy has led successive generations of Russians to steal or destroy Ukrainian heritage. St. Sophia is the heart of Ukraine and is one of just a few monuments that have survived from the time of Kievan Rus. The economic and cultural riches of Kiev was vividly demonstrated by the construction of Christian churches. In the 12th century, the city had more than 300 of them. And medieval Kiev also had 4 big cathedrals, lavishly decorated with mosaics, one of the most expensive technique. One of them was St. Michael Cathedral, built in 12th century. In the early 1920s, Russia moved the capital of Ukraine to Kharkiv, punishing Kiev for its attempts to create an independent Ukrainian state in 2018. However, in 1932, Kiev became the capital once again. The Communist Party, excuse me. The Communist Party insisted that Kiev should create a huge square, like the Red Square in Moscow, for parades and demonstrations. Of course, they demanded that such a square to be built on the territory of old city. For that reason, in 1934-35, St. Michael Cathedral was demolished. The building on the left was erected, and the mirror building had to be built on the site of the cathedral, but it never happened. This is a reconstruction of St. Michael Cathedral. It was rebuilt in 2000. Interestingly, the removal of the mosaic, which was, first of all, it was allowed, thankfully. So the removal of the mosaic prior to the demolition was conducted by the mosaic section of the Leningrad Academy of Fine Art. Ukrainians were not allowed to save their heritage. According to some sources, in the 1970s, the Soviet Union organized a union exhibition and asked Kiev to send the St. Dimitrius, the fresco, the mosaic you see, and other mosaics and icons to Moscow for that temporary exhibition. These objects were never returned to Ukraine. Russia kept them, justifying that they are part of Russian culture. Kiev also impossible to imagine without Lavra, the caves monastery, which is a city underneath the city, And on the territory of Lavra, it was another 12th century cathedral, which was also destroyed. And even I was taught that it was destroyed by Germans, when in fact it was destroyed by the Soviets. Here's this cathedral. And here is, you can see on the right a part of the cathedral that survived. Mosaic and fresco influenced the development of the icon painting school in Kiev, especially in the territory of Lavra. However, again, all these icons are not in Kiev, but in Moscow. In the middle, the angel with golden hair is an amazing icon. Look at his huge eye, a mirror of the soul. Here, a few more famous examples, including the Lady of Volodymyr. And many historians pointed out that Kiev was savagely sacked by Russian princes. One of them was Andrei Bogolyubsky. He also sacked the very first stone church in Ukraine, the Scythian Cathedral, the Church of the Dormition of the Virgin. From the 4 Kievan medieval cathedrals with mosaics in Kiev, only St. Sophia has survived. I would like to underscore that. Therefore, during the first few months of the war, when the Russians, especially when the Russians were not far from Kiev, I was not alone, lost sleep because I worried about St. Sophia. I still worry. I knew that for centuries the Russians had accumulated deeply rooted jealousy and hostility toward the Kievan glorious medieval heritage, and always wanted to destroy it, as we just discussed. Kiev was mentioned approximately 400 BC, when Moscow was established by Kievan Prince Yuri Dolgorukhin. Only in 1147, St. Petersburg accordingly was established in 1703. Therefore, the heritage of Kievan Rus is the most controversial question in Ukrainian and Russian history. By the way, not a single Ukrainian art historian was allowed to write any monograph about St. Sophia or the art of Kievan Rus in general. Russian art historians were always better specialists, and they knew everything better, especially about Ukrainian art. This tendency, unfortunately, was highly controlled by some professors at the Academy of Fine Art in Kiev, where even during the 1980s, after the independence, when I was studying there, they were still in place. Okay, we go a bit further. So in 1988, we celebrated the 1000th anniversary of the Christianization of Kievan Rus, but this great event was stolen from us. All celebrations were in Moscow, not in Kiev. Instead, around this time, the Soviet regime built this arch in Kiev as a symbol of friendship between Ukraine and Russia. For decades, this large titanium arch has stood in Kiev, in central Kiev, towering over a sculpture of 2 men, a Ukrainian and a Russian, holding up a medal representing the Soviet Union Order of Friendship People. Ukraine is planning to demolish it soon, and as you see, this process has already started, as the head of the Russian man lying on the ground indicates. We don't have much time. I will finish very soon. Therefore, I wouldn't read you this, but I really encourage you to read this very short philosophical letter. It's called the first philosophical letter written by Pertchaudiev in 1829. He was a Russian writer and philosopher. And he talks about Russian past, about Russian heritage, about lacking of roots. And some of his expressions are so profound and For instance, he's talking about culture, and he's telling us that Russian culture, which is wholly imported and imitative. People like individuals are moral beings. It takes centuries for their education, and it takes years for that of person. We may be said to be an exception among peoples. We are one of those nations which do not appear to be an integral part of the human race, but exist only in order to teach some great lessons to the world. Of course, Perchudaya was proclaimed mad, but Nikolai I and the Russian elite quickly realized that he was right. They also realized that Ukraine has ancient roots, like Russia. That prompted even more aggressive colonization and Russification of Ukraine. To conclude, I would like briefly to turn to Ukrainian artist Ilya Repin again. Traditional Repin is cast as the father of Russian art. The colonization and censorship not only of his art, but also his writing. Remember, we see this painting. And I just would like to focus briefly on this too. It's hard to avoid noting the Repin attitude towards Ukraine versus Russia, because paintings have a tendency to speak for themselves. Here are two of the most important Repin's canvases. This is a Parisian Cossack writing a letter to the Turkish Sultan and barge holder on the Volga. Repin started to work on this on Cossacks painting in 1880 and finished only in 1891. It took him 11 years. Alexander III immediately bought the painting for 35,000 rubles, at the time the greatest sum ever paid for the Russian painting. Since then, the canvas has been exhibited at the State Russian Museum in St. Petersburg because its subject, its Cossack glory, is the greatest enemy of the Muscovite Tsars and Russian emperors. Compare the cheerful, freedom-loving, and brave Ukrainian Cossacks and slave-like Russians deprived of any freedom or hope. With these two works, Repin clearly showed that Ukraine and Russia are different countries with different cultures, different people with different aspirations, different dreams. In 1914, when Russian war against Ukraine started, this poster widely circulated in Ukraine and in the world. Just these two canvases and one word, choose. Ukrainians made their choice a long time ago. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Thank you so much for that fascinating conversation and presentation, Svitlana. I learned so much and I have so many questions. But first of all, I'd like to encourage anyone in the audience to put any questions you have in the Q&A. I will start us off with a question, and I see that we have one there, but I'd love to kind of continue this conversation for a little while. So I will start off with my question. Svitlana, I was fascinated with this this idea of kind of Russian co-opting of Ukrainian culture. And I'm interested, you mentioned that kind of the Russification of Ukrainian culture started in the 19th century, but I'm wondering if you could point out some moments when it was most intense. For example, was it during the Soviet Union? And Putin seems to be continuing this. I mean, and was it more co-opting and taking things to Moscow, or was it a repressing and destroying, and a little bit of both? I mean, if you could just elaborate both, yeah.
Great question, Michelle. Thank you so much. Steve, can we have another hour? Nikolai II, Nikolai I started aggressive Russification and colonization. Of course, it started before Peter the Great, Catherine II, etc. And it was waves up and down a little bit at the end of the 19th century, in the middle of 19th century, when the famous Ukrainian poet and artist Shevchenko lived. It was the most aggressive because Russia prohibited even to publish in Ukrainian, prohibited to speak in cities in Ukrainian. That's why during my lecture, I pointed that peasants really carried, they saved the core of our identity, of our culture for generations. This is extremely valuable for us. And in the 20th century, it was also very interesting because in 1918, Ukraine had a short breath of freedom. It was independent, and then Russian concentrated all their efforts to recapture Ukraine. They couldn't do it on the battlefield. So they started to talk and cooperate closely with Ukrainian Communist Party, and they promised Ukrainians that they will respect and honor Ukrainian culture, language, roots, only join the Soviet Union. And naive Ukrainians, it's happened a few times in Ukrainian history, unfortunately, as Steve knows. They agreed and they joined the Soviet Union. And for the next approximately 10 years, it was called Ukrainian Renaissance. Lenin indeed allowed Ukrainians to develop culture, art, etc. Academy of Fine Arts that I studied. It was open at the end of 1917, but they flourished. And Malevich returned, and so much was going on, and everything seems perfect. However, when Stalin came back, accumulated power of his hands. As you know, it was a very slow, deliberate process. He started collectivization, industrializations, and peasants were not happy. Peasants worked hard to acquire that land, and nobody wanted to give it away. And numerous rebellions happened all over Ukraine. And of course, Stalin never liked freedom-loving nature of Ukrainians. So he decided to stop it once and for all. And he created this artificial famine, Holodomor, which is I briefly mentioned, but I'm sure the audience well aware of this very tragic event in Ukrainian history. And of course, some parallels with what is going on now in Ukraine. And after that, it was a lot of repressions. Stalin physically killed all Ukrainian modernists, Wojciuk school. Only Fyodor Krzyzewski, one of our Ukrainian artists, influential artists, mysteriously survived. And these policies continued during Stalin until his death. It was practically no change, a little bit of so during Khrushchev, as we know, but then Brezhnev again grabbed his control over Ukraine, and it was a crime to love Ukraine. It was the biggest crime, just to love your country, your land. So it's a very brief overview, Michelle.
I know I asked a very complicated and long question.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. That's very helpful. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A, so I will start with some of those. I have one that says, I laud your program of celebrating Ukrainian art, but was curious about how it is different from Polish or Russian folk patterns, or is the goal to stop calling it Russian art rather than Ukrainian art? So he's thinking about labels and what's the differences between folk art in Russia and Polish art.
Thank you. It's a very important question. which I encourage my colleagues, scholars, art historians to sort it out. I would like to make it clear, Ukrainian and Russian culture are two different things. Remember the map of Slavs, the core of Slavs when the territory of Ukrainians, they spread mostly to the west, some to the east. And of course, Ukrainians settled, many of Ukrainians themselves went, many were brought to Russia. So Stalin especially created this mixture of humans, of nationalities to control, to erase identities of nations, etc. So yes, first of all, we are different cultures, Russian and Ukrainian culture. We have different language. We have a lot in common because Ukraine influenced Russia a lot, and I didn't have opportunity to talk about that, but like Christianity, Russia adopted Christianity almost 100 years later, and so on. It's a lot of Ukrainians, professional, were invited by Peter the Great, by Russian emperors consistently. So Ukrainian had enormous influence on Russian culture, but it was never recognized. Russia was not as strong to admit any influences. And that's why it was extremely important to keep Ukraine in its orbit. Concerning Poland, we have a lot in common with Polish culture, but again, we are different. We have much more in common with Polish folk culture than with Russian. So it's a brief answer. I can go on. I wonder if
we have a couple of other questions, so I'll go ahead. But I think that addresses at least, you know, the basic formation of the question, that there are nuances and distinctions, and that we should be more specific with our language rather than sticking with this kind of umbrella term that the Russian has insisted on, this labeling, this relabeling of Ukrainian culture. So I have another question here. It says, do you think that after the war, the St. Sophia Cathedral, and I apologize if I mispronounced that, Petrska Lavra, can finally be returned to Kiev and taken back and taken away from Moscow? And so this is kind of a speculative question, but you think that, I guess, is it a possibility? Is it a goal? Is it a possibility? I mean, it depends.
It's a very important question. St. Sophia is a national monument. It's controlled by Ministry of Culture of Ukraine. However, Lavra, after independence of Ukraine in 1991, Russian Orthodox Church immediately, settles there. And I don't know, probably most of you familiar that Russian Church cooperates with KGB very closely. In fact, most of the priests are, finished KGB schools or connected, etc. And in many cases all over Ukraine, all of this monastery, including Lavra, Kievo-Pecherska Lavra, they were centers of disinformation, propaganda. Some monasteries even collected weapons, especially in those areas where we have active military events happening. So Russian Orthodox Church is a peculiar church. And what I read now, especially from Ukrainian sources, the process started. They slowly, the Ukrainian government slowly started to investigate the activities, personnel, etc. So I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful that Kiev-Pecherska Lavra will return to Ukrainian church. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think we have one more question. So if other people have others, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. But let me look at this one here. It's regarding mislabeled art. And the question is, by what mechanism are repatriative assignments or renamings or reattributions made? For example, does the public pressure on museums help, or does the task get done because of the efforts of knowledgeable staff and institutions? And so he's thinking the example of the Degas Russian versus Ukrainian dancers, and how does this get accomplished? So the mechanisms of change is the question. Yeah.
This is one of the key questions. Thank you so much for this question. And yes, Degas painting is a good example. And as I pointed, I encourage always my colleagues, museum workers, scholars, to review their old-fashioned thinking. But I have to warn it, it's a very, as I said, it's a very difficult process. It's a slow process, and it needs to be initiated. And the question is, who will initiate it? I will give an example. In summer, I contacted the Malevich Society. And on their homepage, they make a short statement that they're against this barbaric war. But later, they introduce Malevich as a Russian avant-gardist artist. And I wrote them a short, nice letter and explained that time change, we need to change, we need to correct mistakes, and ask them to change this, their writing, and change from Russian artist to Ukrainian artist, which he was. And he himself, as I said, admitted it. And I said during my presentation, I repeat again, he knew what Soviet regime could do. And he was right, exactly right. That's why he wrote this autobiography 2 years before his death. And he wrote that he was Ukrainian. And he wrote the main source of influence on his art. So they reply that, yes, of course. And I thank them and nothing happened. I didn't check recently. The last time I checked, it was probably end of October. So everybody who hears me, please help, write them. We need to be proactive. Changes wouldn't come from nothing. We need to create change. We need to learn, relearn. It's like all of us in Ukraine. When I study history of Ukraine in the university, history of Ukraine was like this, and history of the Communist Party was like this. And after the independence of Ukraine, we had to relearn. We were happily, some of us happily relearned, some never did, unfortunately. But we all humans, we create mistakes and nobody else corrects them. We have to correct them. So
can I just jump in for a second with a question, Michelle, if it's okay?
Of course, yes.
First off, by the way, on this subject, I was just curious while I was sitting here and looked that both Repin and Malevich are noted as Russian artists if you look at Wikipedia.
Exactly.
Although it does note in both cases that they were born in Ukraine, and in the case of Malevich, it then does also say that he was a member of the Ukrainian avant-garde movement, but after initially describing him as a Russian avant-garde artist. So there's definitely still a long, long way to go. But I mean, I will say just in my own teaching, it has definitely caused me to be more careful about how I attribute the particular historical figures that I talk about. But anyway, I want to ask a different question, which is, obviously the whole question of repatriating cultural artifacts is a huge story, not just in Ukraine and in Russia, but worldwide. And a number of the things that you talk about, of course, sound exactly like the way in which the British Museum, acquired a lot of its collections precisely through the history of imperialism. But I was just wondering, in the period since 1991, and especially in periods, when the relationship was not as fraught, obviously nothing like this since 2014, or really even in the Putin years. But I was just wondering if any efforts have been made to try to return any of these Ukrainian icons to Ukraine. I don't know if there have been any efforts in this kind of direction at all. Obviously, they've had, largely mixed and really actually very little success at repatriating things from Great Britain, for example. So it's not an uncommon story, but I'm just wondering if there have been any efforts being made in that kind of direction.
Thank you, Steve. It's the key question. I hope Ukrainian government will think of these questions well and approach them constructively. Yes, after 1991, Alexander Fedoruk was created commission. And Alexander Fedoruk, he was also my advisor, PhD advisor. He was head of this commission, but a little was done. He returned patents somewhere from United States, some few from Europe, etc. But as I know, it practically was nothing returned from Russia. Russia never cooperates in these spheres, and to expect that they will volunteer or return something is, I think it's an illusion. But nevertheless, we need to work on this. Ukrainians need to work on these issues. They, like those mosaics, for instance, which were taken in 1970 for exhibition and never returned, 100% have to be returned. And concerning, by the way, Repin, today was the first time when I call him Ukrainian artist. I had a few presentations last year, and I was careful. What gives me courage, I found few, well, for me, all Ukrainians, it's clear that he's Ukrainian. Only Ukrainian artists can understand the nature of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian peasants, etc. He understood it clearly. But another thing, I found a couple publications which was done at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century during Repin's life, when he was alive, and clearly he probably provided information about himself. And in those publications, it's written that his ancestors were Cossacks. Later, Russians and Soviets, they were famous for that. They destroyed the originals and created new birth certificates and other sources. Vladimir Stasov was very famous for this. He rewrote Ivan Kramskoy letters, and also when Repin was in Paris, and he wrote very emotional letters describing how much he's missing Ukraine. And then later he wrote how much he's impressed with Impressionists, and he didn't like that. So he took courage and rewrote his letter and published them, even immediately at that time, which Repin was very upset. But it just indicates that for Russians and Soviets, there is no norms, there is no rules. Unfortunately, you can't really trust them. This is a tragedy. This is something really tragic. Just read Chadayev's first philosophical letter, and he's talking exactly about the same issues. So it's a very complicated process, but we need to do it. Ukrainians need to do it.
Yeah, unfortunately, as you were talking about, of course, the amount of art and culture that's going to need repatriating is simply growing as a result of this war. And I was just reading the other day about the emptying of the Kherson Art Museum that they've, of course, now discovered after it was liberated. So, yeah, it's a really big and important question that's going to be ongoing for quite some time.
So it looks like we have a few more questions. They're all very similar along these lines. And so one of these is actually asking about resources. And so the question is, in this age of misinformation, how can art history students identify when Ukrainian art and history has been altered or erased by Russia? And asks if there are any resources you can share that we can use to find the truth to protect Ukrainian heritage and culture. So I don't know if perhaps there's a way afterward, if you have specific resources, maybe we can share some sort of bibliography, or if you have any specific ideas about how to do this and how do students should approach this question?
Not like Malevich, the first which I think it's Miroslav Skandry wrote a couple books about, not specifically on Malevich, but talking about Ukrainian modernism, and he was talking about Malevich. There are some publication articles on Repin, but in general, there is not really much book on Ukrainian art history in general, so it's put pressure, I guess, on me. So yes, we have to rewrite Ukrainian art history. Unfortunately, when I moved to America and started to teach, I was completely shocked because in addition that every called me Russians, in each history book, and Steve, you know it better than I, the phrase like Russia was baptized at the end of the 10th century. This phrase was just like, surprised me for so much. Russia didn't exist in the end of the 10th century. It was Kievan Rus. And so such huge mistake, and from such huge mistake to naming everything, Scythian gold, Scythian culture was Russian, everything was Russian. So there are a lot of big mistakes and small mistakes. And Ukrainian art historians and historians need to rewrite this history, and I guess we will.
I know I was struck with, I mean, I think the answer is archival research and really looking at, really looking at the sources. And I think that's what you do with Malevich. I was really struck. I mean, just the renaming, just the relabeling opens up a whole avenue of research. I never would, that comparison that you made with the lace and with the folk culture, you wouldn't do that unless you had that label of that association with Ukraine. And then all of a sudden that changes the narrative. I mean, the narrative for so long has been this kind of esoteric interpretation of Malevich about, spirituality and abstraction and this, but actually it's very culturally identified. And I think that it's so interesting. It changes the whole interpretation, just that little label and that connection to a culture. So it's really important and fascinating.
Just to add, I completely agree, and Western scholar completely misunderstood and misread Malevich and his art. And if you practically in the past, especially when you pick up any of the publications, they will talk about huge influence of the revolution on Malevich art. The revolution 1917s, they find his suprematism and everything, whatever he did, etc. What is far from the truth, at least. And in fact,
I can just, jump in and say, I think my field, so people who, focus on the history of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, I think a lot of us are right now questioning a lot of our assumptions, things that we just kind of breezily never really thought much about, talking about Russian avant-garde culture without actually talking about the complications of what that means. And so, part of my answer to that question about how do you know is I'd probably start from a point of view of skepticism about anybody who's referred to as a Russian artist and decide that you need to look into it and to figure it out, because it may not in fact be the right way to talk about it. And certainly what I've taken to talking about, I still want to talk about this culture in my courses. And I'm teaching courses on the history of the Russian Empire. And so I talk about the cultures of the peoples of the Russian Empire. And then I can get into some of the specifics of who these people are, because of course it's not just Ukrainians either. There are other peoples from the Russian Empire who get folded in to this notion of what Russian right culture is. So we're unfortunately, and I feel like I jump in to be the killjoy, but we are unfortunately out of time. But I just want to thank Michelle for setting this up. I think this was just a wonderful addition to the program of things that we've had over the course of the semester. And I want to thank myself personally to thank Svitlana for coming and making this wonderful presentation with all of these terrific images, and I think giving a lot of us a lot to think about. But I'll leave it to Michelle and Svitlana, to you both, to close it out.
Well, and I just want to add to Steve's thank you. This was so fascinating, and I think it's going to be changing how I approach some things in my courses. It was really, really illuminating, and I just thank you so much for, again, wonderful images and so many things to think about. So thank you, Svitlana.
I would like to thank both of you for allowing me this platform and for supporting of Ukraine. Please continue to support Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting for all of us. And thank you all who joined us today. And to all of you, please support Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.